What would you do if you lost the one thing that defined your entire existence? Could you reinvent yourself from nothing? Could you turn your greatest loss into your most revolutionary discovery? The lecture hall at UC Berkeley fell into an uncomfortable silence as the elderly man made his way down the center aisle. Darius Bennett was 66 years old, with salt and pepper hair that had gone more salt than pepper-wearing faded jeans with frayed cuffs and a jacket that had seen better decades. His weathered brown hands carried a single worn leather folder, and his shoes, scuffed work boots that clicked softly against the polished floor, seemed almost defiant in this temple of academic prestige. 300 pairs of eyes tracked his movement. Graduate students in pressed shirts and designer glasses. Tenured professors with endowed chairs and published monographs. Music theorists whose entire careers were built on understanding sound. And at the front of the room, seated with her arms crossed and her expression carefully neutral, was Professor Rebecca Hartwell, one of the most respected musicologists in the country. The contrast was impossible to ignore. This was a man who looked like he'd just walked in from the streets approaching a 9-foot Steinway grand piano that cost more than most people's houses. A man who, according to the introduction that had just been given, hadn't heard a single sound in over 20 years. How did this man who hasn't heard a single note, not a chord, not a melody, not even the simplest scale, end up here about to challenge everything these experts believed about music? The answer begins 3 decades earlier in a smoky jazz club in New Orleans, where a young pianist was about to have everything he'd ever known torn away from him. But before we travel back to that moment, you need to understand what was at stake in that Berkeley lecture hall. Professor Rebecca Hartwell was 50 years old and had spent her entire professional life studying music theory. She had a PhD from Yale, a tenured position at one of the world's leading universities, and 17 published books on musicology acoustics and the neurological basis of musical perception. Her students called her brilliant but demanding. Her colleagues called her thorough, but occasionally inflexible. She herself would probably have said she was simply rigorous, that good scholarship required skepticism, especially when faced with extraordinary claims. And the claim being made today was, by any measure, extraordinary. The seminar was titled Redefining Musical Perception, a Tactile Approach to Composition. The description in this department newsletter had been vague but intriguing. A guest speaker would demonstrate how musical understanding could exist independent of auditory perception, how composition could be guided by vibration rather than sound, how the deaf could not only experience music, but create it at the highest level. Rebecca had agreed to host the seminar largely as a favor to one of her research assistants, a promising young woman named Maya, who worked in the music technology lab. Maya had been persistent, almost desperate in her advocacy for this speaker. There was something personal in her insistence, though. Rebecca hadn't pressed for details. But looking at Darius Bennett now, Rebecca felt her skepticism harden into something closer to certainty. This wasn't going to work. It couldn't work. Music was fundamentally about sound, about the intricate relationships between frequencies, about harmonic structures that could only be perceived through hearing. You couldn't compose music, you couldn't hear any more than you could paint pictures you couldn't see. Around the room, she could see her colleagues shifting in their seats. Dr. Patterson from the composition department was frowning at his phone, clearly checking email. 2 graduate students in the back row were whispering to each other, not quite hiding their smirks. The student sitting directly in front of Rebecca had written in his notebook, "This is going to be a disaster." Only Maya, standing near the piano and looking at Darius with an expression of fierce pride mixed with anxiety, seemed to believe this demonstration might succeed. Was this man a genius, who had discovered something revolutionary about the nature of music itself? Or was he simply deluded, a tragic figure, clinging to a profession that his disability had placed forever beyond his reach? In 60 minutes, everyone in that room would have their answer, and that answer would change not just their understanding of music, but their understanding of human potential itself. But to appreciate what happened next, you need to know who Darius Bennett was before the silence. You need to understand what he lost. And you need to see how that loss became the foundation for something entirely new. New Orleans, 1985. The Blue Note Jazz Club on Frenchman Street. If you'd walked into the Blue Note on a Thursday night that summer, you would have heard Darius Bennett before you saw him. The music would have hit you the moment you opened the door. Not just sound, but feeling the kind of piano playing that seemed to bypass your ears entirely and speak directly to something deeper. Complex chord progressions that shouldn't have worked, but did. Improvised runs that started somewhere familiar and then took you to places you'd never been. Technical precision married to raw emotional honesty. And then you would have seen him. 28 years old, lean and focused, hunched over the keys with his eyes half closed and his fingers moving in patterns that seemed impossible. Darius had the kind of natural talent that made other musicians jealous and grateful, at the same time jealous because they'd never match it, grateful because they got to witness it. The club was packed that night, as it was most nights when Darius played. The small tables were crowded with locals and tourists, music students and music lovers, people who'd heard through the grapevine that you couldn't miss Darius Bennett if you cared about jazz. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of bourbon, and the brick walls seemed to pulse with the vibrations of the upright bass and the shuffle of the drums. But it was Darius's piano that held everything together, that made the chaos into something beautiful. He was in the middle of his own composition, a piece he called Crossroads at Midnight, when he caught sight of his wife Sarah sitting at a table near the front. She was holding their daughter Maya, who was 3 years old, and somehow managing to sleep through the music, her small head resting on her mother's shoulder. Sarah caught his eye and smiled, and Darius felt that familiar surge of gratitude and disbelief that this was his life. He'd grown up in the Treme neighborhood, learned piano from his grandmother, who'd learned from her grandmother, part of a musical lineage that stretched back further than anyone could trace. He'd practiced in churches and school auditoriums, and eventually at the New Orleans Center for Creative Arts, where his teachers had recognized something special. By his early 20s, he was playing with established jazz musicians twice his age. By his mid-20s, he was leading his own trio. And now at 28, he was starting to get national attention. There'd been the recording contract with Blue Note Records, no relation to the club, but the coincidence felt like destiny. There'd been the tour booked for next fall, 23 cities, opening for one of the biggest names in contemporary jazz. There'd been the review in Downbeat magazine that called him the most exciting young pianist to emerge from New Orleans since the Marsalis brothers. There'd been talk of a residency at the Village Vanguard in New York, the kind of opportunity that could define a career. Darius let the song wind down, let the final chord hang in the air for a long moment before lifting his hands from the keys. The applause was immediate and loud, and he stood and took a small bow, grinning at the audience. This was what he'd been born to do. This was who he was, a musician, a jazz pianist, a keeper of a tradition, and an innovator pushing it forward. After the set, he made his way to Sarah's table, kissing her forehead and gently stroking Maya's hair. His daughter stirred, but didn't wake. "You were incredible tonight," Sarah said softly, her eyes shining. "That new piece, I've never heard anything like it." "Still working out some of the harmonies," Darius said, sliding into the chair next to her. "But it's getting there." "Everything you touch turns to music," she said. It wasn't flattery. It was just true. He had everything. A wife he loved, a daughter who made him laugh every day, a career that was taking off exactly the way he'd dreamed, music that poured out of him as naturally as breathing, a community that respected and celebrated his work, a future that seemed limitless. What Darius didn't know, couldn't have known, was that he had exactly 7 more years. 7 years before everything changed. 7 years before the music stopped. 7 years before he lost it all and had to discover whether there was anything left when the sound was gone. September 17th, 1992. Interstate 10, just outside Baton Rouge. Darius was 35 years old now, returning from a gig in Houston. It had been a good weekend, 3 sold-out shows, enthusiastic audiences, and a conversation with a promoter about a possible European tour. Sarah and Maya, who was now 10, had stayed home in New Orleans. He'd promised to be back by Sunday evening for Maya's piano recital on Monday. She'd been studying seriously for 2 years now, and while she'd never have Darius's prodigious talent, she had dedication and discipline that impressed her teachers. He was thinking about Maya's recital, mentally reviewing the piece she planned to perform, when the 18-wheeler in the next lane blew a tire. Later, the accident report would note that the truck driver wasn't at fault. The tire failure was catastrophic and instantaneous. The driver lost control. The massive vehicle jackknifed across 2 lanes. Darius had maybe 2 seconds to react. He swerved right, trying to avoid the trailer as it swung toward him. His car, a 10-year-old Honda that he kept meaning to replace, hit the guardrail at 65 miles per hour. The impact sent him spinning back across the highway. Another vehicle, unable to stop in time, hit his passenger side. And then, in the terrible mathematics of momentum and force, his car flipped. Darius was unconscious before the car finished rolling. He woke up 4 days later in a hospital in Baton Rouge. Sarah was there, her eyes red from crying. The first thing he noticed was that her lips were moving, but he couldn't hear what she was saying. He tried to tell her that something was wrong with his ears, that everything was muffled, that she needed to speak up. But even his own voice sounded wrong. He could feel the vibration in his throat and chest. But the sound itself was distant, underwater, barely there. The doctor came in shortly after. Dr. Patricia Morrison, a neurologist with 20 years of experience. She pulled up a chair next to Darius's bed and began to speak, her mouth forming words carefully. Sarah moved to his other side, taking his hand. Darius caught fragments. Temporal bone fracture, bilateral damage, cochlear, severe head trauma. He interrupted her, his voice too loud, because he couldn't hear himself properly. "I can't hear you very well. Can you speak up?" Dr. Morrison exchanged a glance with Sarah, and in that moment, Darius felt ice in his stomach. He knew. Before the doctor said anything else, he knew. "Mr. Bennett," Dr. Morrison said, speaking more slowly now, enunciating clearly so he could maybe read her lips a little. "The accident caused severe trauma to both of your temporal bones. That's the part of the skull that houses the inner ear structures. We've done extensive testing over the past few days while you've been unconscious." She paused, and Darius could see her gathering herself to deliver news she'd probably delivered before, but never got easier. "The damage to your cochlear structures is extensive and permanent. Your hearing loss is profound and bilateral. That means both ears, and I'm sorry, but there's no treatment that can restore it." Not surgery, not hearing aids, nothing. The level of destruction to the delicate structures of your inner ear is simply too severe. Darius stared at her. He could see her mouth moving as she continued talking something about rehabilitation and support services and learning to adapt. But her words, the few he could still catch, were fading, getting more distant, like she was walking away from him, even though she was sitting right there. By the end of that first week, even those fragments were gone. The profound hearing loss became total deafness. The muffled underwater quality of sound disappeared entirely, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence, like cotton stuffed into his skull, like being buried alive. The doctors explained it clinically. His brain had been receiving degraded signals from the damaged cochlear nerves, but as the trauma continued to evolve, as swelling increased and damaged tissue died, those final neural connections had failed. What remained was nothing. No sound. Not even tinnitus, that phantom ringing that many deaf people experienced. Just perfect, absolute, suffocating silence. Sarah tried to be strong. She really did. She learned some basic sign language from a hospital social worker. She wrote notes when they needed to communicate. She held his hand and told him through writing that they would figure this out together, that he was still the same person, that she loved him. But Darius could see the fear in her eyes, and he understood it because he felt it too. Music had been his entire identity. Not just his career, but who he was at the most fundamental level. His first memories were of his grandmother teaching him piano. His entire life had been organized around sound practicing, performing, listening, creating. He thought in musical terms. He experienced emotions through melodic patterns. He understood the world through its acoustic properties. And now that world was gone. The hospital discharged him after 3 weeks. Sarah drove him home to their house in the Bywater neighborhood, a small shotgun double they'd bought 5 years earlier. Maya ran out when they pulled up, but stopped short when she saw her father. He was thinner, moving carefully with a haunted look in his eyes that frightened her. "Daddy," she said, and started to cry when he didn't respond. Sarah knelt down and gently turned Maya toward her, explained through her own tears that Daddy couldn't hear anymore, that they had to look at him when they talked, that everything was different now. That night, Darius sat in his music room, the small converted porch, where he kept his upright piano and his record collection and his composition notebooks. He put his hands on the piano keys but didn't press down. He couldn't bear the idea of playing without hearing, of going through motions that would produce sound he'd never experience. The calls started coming within a week. His agent gently explaining that the tour was being canceled. The record label offering sympathy, but noting that his contract had a health clause. Fellow musicians saying they were sorry but weren't sure how to help. The club owner from the Blue Note asking if Darius knew anyone who could take over his regular Thursday slot. Each conversation conducted through written notes or Sarah's interpretation was another small death. His career wasn't just ending. It was evaporating, leaving no trace, as if his decade of work had never happened. Sarah held on for 18 months. She tried, genuinely tried, to adapt to their new reality. She worked extra hours as a dental hygienist to cover their bills when the music income disappeared. She researched resources for the deaf. She suggested Darius could teach or compose using computer software, or find some other way to stay connected to music. But Darius was sinking into a depression so profound, it changed his entire personality. The vibrant, confident, creative man she'd married was gone, replaced by someone who rarely left the house, who stopped bathing regularly, who sat for hours staring at nothing. He started drinking, then drinking heavily. He stopped returning friends' calls, the few friends who still tried to call. One morning in March 1994, Sarah sat down at the kitchen table with a letter she'd written the night before. Darius read it slowly, each word a knife. I can't do this anymore. I'm taking Maya to stay with my sister in Atlanta. I've filed for legal separation. I love you. I'll always love the man you were, but I can't watch you disappear like this. And I can't let Maya watch it either. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. They were gone by that afternoon. Darius didn't fight it, didn't argue or protest or beg them to stay. Part of him knew Sarah was right. Part of him knew he was toxic now that his despair was poisoning everyone around him. Part of him thought Maya would be better off without him. But another part of him, the part that took over after they left, whispered that this proved what he'd suspected all along. That without music, he was nothing. That his identity, his value, his entire reason for existing had been taken away. That there was no point in continuing. He sold the house for far less than it was worth. Moved into a tiny studio apartment in a rough part of town, where the rent was cheap and nobody asked questions. He was 37 years old, and he'd lost everything. His hearing, his career, his family, his home, his identity, his future. The money from the house sale lasted about a year, supplemented by odd jobs that didn't require much interaction. Night security work, inventory, stocking anything where being deaf wasn't a disqualification. But the depression only deepened. He stopped eating regularly, stopped caring about anything, started thinking seriously about ending it. And then, on a gray Tuesday afternoon in November 1995, he decided he would. He had a gun he'd bought for home protection years earlier. He had no reason left to live. It was time. But before he did it, he wanted to hear jazz one more time, or not hear it. He couldn't hear it, but at least have it playing a final acknowledgement of what his life had been before it ended. He turned on his old boombox radio, found a jazz station, and sat down in the only chair in his apartment to wait for the song to end. Then he'd do it. Then it would be over. He didn't know that what happened next would change everything. The song that came on was Charlie Parker's Ornithology. Darius couldn't hear it, but he knew the station's format, and he could imagine it: the frenetic bebop melody, the complex chord changes the virtuosic saxophone work that had inspired him as a student. He sat there looking at the gun on the table next to him, waiting for the song to end. 3 minutes, maybe 4. Then he'd be done. But then he felt something. At first he thought he was imagining it, a slight vibration in his feet, barely perceptible. He frowned, confused. The radio was on the table across the room, at least 8 feet away. But there was definitely something, a pulsing sensation, rhythmic, coming in waves. The bass. He was feeling the bass line. Darius stood up, moving slowly toward the radio. The vibration got stronger. He knelt down, putting his hand on the table. The wood was vibrating. Not much, but enough that he could feel it clearly now. Each bass note created a pulse. Each drum hit sent a tiny shock through the surface. Without thinking, he pressed his ear against the table's surface. Nothing. Still silence. But his hands, flat against the wood, could feel the pattern. There was rhythm there. Structure. He couldn't hear the melody or the harmony, couldn't hear Charlie Parker's saxophone at all, but the foundational elements, the bass, the drums were transmitting through vibration. Something stirred in Darius's chest. Not hope, exactly. More like curiosity. The kind of curiosity that had driven him to music in the first place, the need to understand how sound worked, what made certain combinations of notes beautiful and others dissonant. He moved the radio to the floor, sat down cross-legged in front of it, turned the volume all the way up, placed both hands on the speaker grill. The vibrations were much stronger here. He could feel the bass clearly, could feel the drums, could even feel something that might have been the piano comping chords. It was crude, limited a tiny fraction of the information that sound would have provided. But it was something. It was information. It was music, or at least an echo of music traveling through a different sensory pathway. Darius sat there for the next 2 hours as the jazz station played song after song. He kept his hands on the speaker, learning its language. Fast songs created rapid, intense vibrations. Slow songs made gentler pulses. Different instruments created different qualities of vibration. Bass was low, and rolling drums were sharp and percussive. Piano was somewhere in between. When his hands got tired, he pressed other parts of his body against the speaker. His forearms, his chest, his forehead. Each position gave slightly different information, emphasized different frequencies. His chest seemed especially sensitive to lower frequencies. His fingertips caught higher ones. As the afternoon turned into evening, Darius felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years: excitement. Not happiness, he was too damaged for that, too hollowed out, but a kind of intellectual engagement, a problem-solving energy, a sense that maybe there was something here worth exploring. He'd read somewhere years ago in a music psychology course that deaf people could perceive music through vibration. The famous example was Evelyn Glennie, the Scottish percussionist, who'd been profoundly deaf since age 12, but had become one of the world's leading musicians. Darius had always found that interesting, but had never really understood it. How could you truly experience music without hearing it? But now, with his hands on this cheap boombox speaker, he was starting to glimpse an answer. You couldn't experience music the same way. The information coming through vibration was limited, crude, missing most of what made music complex and beautiful. But it was information. And if you could learn to read that information, to interpret it, to understand its patterns and structures, could you create music based on vibration alone? The question formed slowly in his mind, almost reluctantly, as if his brain was afraid to hope. But once it was there, he couldn't let it go. He thought about his piano at home. No, not at home anymore. He'd sold that piano, but he could get another one. Uprights were cheap, second-hand. If he could set up a system where the vibrations from the piano were amplified, somehow made more perceptible, could he learn to play by feel instead of by sound? The technical challenges were immediately obvious. Piano strings vibrated at hundreds of cycles per second, too fast for direct tactile perception of individual oscillations. What you'd feel wouldn't be the vibration itself, but the pressure waves it created, the movement of air, the resonance in the instrument's soundboard. But that might be enough. If he could learn to associate specific vibration patterns with specific notes, specific chords, specific musical structures. Darius looked at the gun still sitting on the table. Then he looked at the radio. Then he made a choice. He couldn't hear music anymore. That was true, and it would always be true. But maybe he could feel it. And if he could feel it, perhaps he could understand it in a new way. And if he could understand it in a new way, perhaps he could create it differently. It wasn't the life he'd planned. It wasn't the career he'd built. It wasn't playing at the Village Vanguard, or recording albums, or touring internationally. But it was something. It was a direction. It was a reason not to pull the trigger. That night, instead of ending his life, Darius Bennett began it again. He started simply, methodically, scientifically. He went to the public library and checked out books on acoustics, on the physics of sound, on how vibrations propagated through different materials. He couldn't hear, but he could read, and reading became his new way of learning about music. He discovered that sound was pressure waves traveling through air, but those same pressure waves could travel through any medium water, wood, metal, human tissue. Different materials transmitted different frequencies more effectively. Wood was good for mid-range frequencies, metal for higher ones. The human body was essentially a sophisticated vibration detector with different parts sensitive to different frequency ranges. He learned about hertz and decibels, about frequency response, and harmonic overtones. He learned that what he thought of as a single note was actually a complex bundle of frequencies, the fundamental frequency plus harmonics, overtones, resonances. And while he couldn't hear any of that complexity, different frequencies created different vibration patterns. In theory, with enough sensitivity and training, he could learn to distinguish between notes based purely on how they felt. In theory. The practical challenges were enormous. He had no money for equipment. He had no training in this kind of sensory substitution. He had no mentor, no guide, no one who'd done this before at the level he was imagining. Evelyn Glennie played percussion, where the connection between striking an instrument and feeling its vibration was direct and immediate. Piano was more complex, more subtle, more dependent on the nuances of attack and decay that he wasn't sure vibration could capture. But he had time. He had nothing but time. No job to go to, no family to care for, no social obligations. His entire life could be devoted to this single question. Could he relearn music through touch? He bought a second-hand upright piano for $200 from a church that was upgrading. It was old and somewhat out of tune, but the soundboard was intact, and that was what mattered. He couldn't afford to have it moved professionally, so he convinced the guy who lived upstairs, a large man named Marcus, who rarely spoke, but seemed decent, to help him maneuver it up the stairs in exchange for a 6-pack of beer. The piano barely fit in his studio apartment, taking up most of the floor space. But when Darius put his hands on it, pressing his palms flat against the wooden case while pressing a key, he could feel it vibrate. Not as strongly as he'd hoped, but enough to work with. He started with single notes. Played middle C, felt the vibration. Played D, felt a slightly different pattern. E, different again. At first, the differences were so subtle he couldn't reliably distinguish them. But he practiced. Hours every day, then more hours. Playing notes, feeling them, training his tactile sense the way he'd once trained his ear. He created a notebook system trying to document what each note felt like. C, steady medium pulse center of chest. F, sharper, faster, more in fingertips. The descriptions were crude and subjective, but they helped him start to build a mental map of the piano's vibration landscape. After a month, he could reliably identify single notes by feel alone. After 2 months, he could distinguish between octaves. After 3 months, he was starting to perceive chords, though not their specific notes, just a sense of whether they were major or minor, consonant or dissonant based on the quality of vibration they produced. It was slow, frustrating work. He'd been able to play piano at an advanced level since he was 15. His fingers automatically finding the right keys, his ear instantly recognizing any harmonic structure. Now he was relearning everything from scratch, like a child at his first lesson, except harder, because the feedback he was getting was so much more limited than sound. There were days he wanted to quit. Days the old depression crept back in, whispering that this was pointless, that he was deluding himself, that you couldn't really make music without hearing. But he'd push through, force himself to practice 1 more hour, learn 1 more chord, refine his technique, 1 more increment. He started experimenting with ways to enhance the vibrations. He built a crude amplification system from a junked stereo, connecting the piano to speakers positioned under his chair and against the wall behind him. It wasn't sophisticated, but it made the vibrations stronger, easier to perceive. He could feel bass notes in his bones now, could sense the resonance in his chest and spine. He discovered that different parts of his body were sensitive to different frequency ranges. His chest was best for bass, his fingertips for treble. His feet pressed against a speaker on the floor could detect rhythm patterns. He started using his whole body as a sensory system, becoming a kind of human antenna tuned to vibration. 6 months in, he played his first scale from memory, 8 notes ascending and descending, all identified correctly by feel. It was a tiny victory, but it felt massive. It felt like maybe this could actually work. He began studying music theory more deeply than he ever had before. When he could hear theory had been somewhat intuitive, he understood harmonic progressions because he could hear how they wanted to resolve. Now he had to approach it analytically, mathematically, learning the structural rules and applying them without auditory confirmation. He read everything he could find about composition, about how great composers thought about music. He learned that Beethoven had continued composing after going deaf, though the mechanisms were debated. Some scholars thought Beethoven maintained some residual hearing longer than commonly believed. Others suggested he composed from memory, using his deep knowledge of how music worked to create pieces in his mind that he could no longer hear. But Darius was trying to do something different. He wasn't composing from memory or from theoretical knowledge alone. He was trying to develop a new kind of musical perception, one based entirely on vibration that would let him experience and create music in real time. By the end of his first year, he'd developed basic proficiency. He could play simple pieces, children's songs, basic folk melodies, using only vibration as feedback. He could tell when he hit a wrong note, because it felt wrong, created the wrong vibration pattern in the structure he was building. He could adjust his playing to create different dynamic levels, different touches, different emotional qualities, all based on how the piano responded physically rather than acoustically. But he knew this wasn't enough. This was the equivalent of learning to read at a first-grade level when he'd once been able to read Shakespeare. If he was going to make this work really work at a level that would let him compose, seriously contribute something meaningful to music, he had to go deeper. He had to learn not just to translate sound into vibration, but to think in vibration as a native language. To stop thinking of it as a substitute for hearing and start thinking of it as its own thing, with its own logic, its own aesthetics, its own possibilities. And that would take years. The next decade of Darius Bennett's life was defined by obsession. Not the destructive obsession of his depression years, but the focused obsession of someone who'd found a problem vast enough to contain a lifetime of work. He was 38 years old when he started. He would be 48 before he'd feel ready to show anyone what he'd discovered. The technical learning curve was steep. Darius had never thought of himself as a scientist, but that's what he had to become. He needed to understand the physics of vibration at a level that went beyond what the library books offered. He needed to build equipment that didn't exist. He needed to document his findings with the rigor of academic research, even though no academic institution was guiding him. Money was a constant problem. He worked night shifts as a security guard at a warehouse, a job he could do despite being deaf, and that left his days free for practice and research. The pay was terrible, but it kept him fed and housed. He spent almost nothing on anything else. No restaurants, no entertainment, no new clothes, unless the old ones literally fell apart. Every spare dollar went into piano maintenance or equipment for his experiments. He built his first serious vibration amplification system in 1996, cobbling it together from components salvaged from broken speakers, a powered subwoofer someone had thrown away, and an old amplifier he bought at a pawn shop for $20. The system was crude, but it worked. When he played the piano with this setup, he could feel vibrations strong enough to distinguish not just between notes, but between different qualities of touch: a soft press versus a hard strike, a sustained note versus a staccato one. This opened up new dimensions of expression. He could start to think about dynamics, about articulation, about all the nuances that made music music, and not just a series of pitches. He filled notebooks with observations. Forte C creates broader, more diffuse vibration than piano C. Staccato feels like sharp pulses. Legato creates overlapping wave patterns. In 1997, he discovered transducers. These were devices that converted electrical signals into mechanical vibrations, often used in specialty speakers, or for creating bass effects in home theater systems. But they had another application. You could attach them to surfaces like a piano bench or a floor platform, and they'd transmit vibrations directly through the surface into whatever was touching it. Darius bought 4 small transducers from an electronics hobby shop, spending nearly 2 weeks' worth of grocery money. He mounted them under a wooden platform he built himself, then connected them to his amplification system. Now, when he played piano, the vibrations didn't just come from the instrument, they came up through his feet, through the bench surrounding him, in a field of tactile information. The difference was extraordinary. It was like going from watching a movie on a small black and white TV to watching it on a full-color screen. The amount of information he could perceive increased dramatically. He could feel the full frequency spectrum, now could distinguish between bass, mid-range, and treble in ways that had been impossible before. He started to develop what he thought of as a tactile vocabulary. Each note had a characteristic feel, a unique signature of vibration frequency and pattern. Middle C felt centered, balanced like a heartbeat. G above middle C felt brighter, faster, more energetic. Low F felt heavy, almost ominous. High E felt delicate, almost ticklish on his fingertips. But more than individual notes, he learned to feel relationships. A perfect fifth, say C and G played together, created a stable consonant vibration pattern, smooth and regular. A diminished fifth was unstable, the vibrations almost fighting each other. A major chord felt open and bright. A minor chord had a darker, more complex vibration quality. This was the breakthrough he'd been searching for. He wasn't just translating sound into touch, he was discovering that musical relationships themselves, the harmonic structures that made certain combinations of notes work together, were reflected in the physics of vibration. Consonance and dissonance weren't just auditory phenomena. They were physical phenomena, and they could be perceived through touch. By 1999, 4 years into his work, Darius had developed a theoretical framework he called vibrational music theory. It was an extension of traditional music theory, but grounded in the physical properties of vibration rather than the psychological properties of sound perception. Traditional music theory explained why a major third sounded pleasing by referencing frequency ratios and the harmonic series, and how the human ear and brain processed acoustic information. Vibrational music theory explained why a major third felt pleasing by analyzing how those same frequency ratios created stable reinforcing vibration patterns that the human body's tactile sense could detect and interpret as harmonious. The two approaches led to similar conclusions after all they were describing the same underlying physics, but the emphasis was different. Traditional theory privileged what was audible. Vibrational theory privileged what was feelable. And there were some interesting differences in those domains. For example, very low frequencies below about 20 Hz, where they became subsonic, were barely audible but highly tactile. You couldn't hear them, but you could definitely feel them, especially in your chest and stomach. Darius started experimenting with compositions that used these subsonic elements, intently creating a foundation of vibration that would be imperceptible to hearing people, but that he could use as a structural element in his playing. Similarly, he discovered that certain complex chords that were dissonant to the ear, that sounded harsh or unpleasant, actually created interesting, almost mesmerizing vibration patterns. If you stopped thinking about whether they sounded good and focused purely on how they felt, they opened up new harmonic possibilities. This was the goal he'd been reaching toward, not to imitate how music worked for hearing people, but to discover how music could work for a deaf person. To find the native logic of vibration-based composition. In 2001, he bought his first computer. It was used outdated temperamental, but it ran a simple MIDI sequencing program. MIDI musical instrument. Digital interface was a technical standard that let electronic instruments and computers communicate. With MIDI, Darius could compose on his piano, and the computer would record the notes, digitally displaying them as notation that he could read. This was revolutionary for his work. For the first time, he could see exactly what he was playing. He could compose by feel, then check the notation to see if he'd made errors, if his tactile perception was accurately matching the harmonic structures he intended. It was like getting a feedback loop he hadn't had before. And it revealed something important. His tactile sense, after 5 years of intense training, was remarkably accurate. When he played a C major chord by feel, the MIDI recording showed a C major chord. When he played a melody he'd composed, the intervals were correct. His nervous system had adapted, had learned to extract musical information from vibration with a precision he hadn't known was possible. But accuracy wasn't enough. Anyone could learn to hit the right notes. What made someone a musician was expression interpretation, the ability to convey emotion and meaning through sound. Could he do that through vibration? He started experimenting with his own compositions, creating pieces specifically designed for tactile perception. These weren't transcriptions of existing music. They were new works built from the ground up around vibrational principles. One early piece, which he titled Pressure Waves, used patterns of sustained bass notes overlaid with faster melodic figures in the treble. To a hearing person, it might have sounded interesting, but fairly conventional. But the vibrational experience was different. The sustained bass created a constant pulsing foundation you felt in your torso, while the melodic figures created lighter dancing sensations in your hands and arms. The piece was designed to be felt as much as heard. Another composition. Interference patterns deliberately used dissonant intervals, minor seconds, tritones, major sevenths, to create complex, almost chaotic vibration patterns. The physical sensation was unsettling, almost uncomfortable, which was the point. The piece was about tension and conflict. And Darius was trying to convey that through tactile dissonance rather than auditory dissonance. He worked on these pieces obsessively, refining them, trying to develop a compositional language that was native to vibration. It was hard, frustrating work. He had no models to follow, no teachers to guide him. He was inventing from scratch. and he had no audience. No one to share his work with, no one to tell him if what he was doing made any sense. He was working in complete isolation, driven by his own curiosity and the gnawing need to prove to himself more than anyone that his disability hadn't ended his ability to be a musician. The rejection started in 2003 when he first tried to share his work publicly. He wrote to the music theory department at Tulane University, explaining his research and asking if he could present his findings at their weekly colloquium. They never responded. He sent a paper outlining vibrational music theory to the Journal of Music Theory. They rejected it without review, saying it fell outside their scope. He contacted several disability rights organizations thinking they might be interested in his approach to accessible music. Most ignored him. One wrote back suggesting he might benefit from counseling to help him accept his limitations rather than deny them. Each rejection stung, but Darius kept working. He was too far into this now to stop. And somewhere in the back of his mind was the certainty, maybe delusional, maybe not, that what he'd discovered was real and important, that he'd found something genuinely new about how humans could experience and create music. By 2005, 10 years into his research, Darius had composed over 30 original pieces. He'd refined his equipment system. He'd documented his theoretical framework in hundreds of pages of notes. He'd developed techniques for tactile composition that he believed could be taught to other deaf musicians. But he still had no way to share any of it. No platform, no credibility, no access to the academic or artistic communities that might have been interested. He was 48 years old, working as a night security guard, living alone in a one-room apartment, and the whole world thought, if it thought of him at all, that he was a washed-up jazz pianist who'd lost his career to a tragic accident. What he didn't know was that his daughter Maya, who he hadn't seen in 11 years, was about to come looking for him. And when she did, everything would change. The Facebook message arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2010. Darius had created a Facebook account a few months earlier, partly to see if he could find any updates about Sarah or Maya, partly just to have some minimal connection to the world. He rarely logged in and had no friends listed. But there it was. A message from Maya Bennett. His heart started pounding as he opened it. The message was short. "I don't know if you'll see this, or if you even remember me. I'm your daughter. I'm 21 now, living in Berkeley, California. I've been thinking about you a lot lately. If you want to meet, I'll fly to New Orleans. No pressure. Just let me know." Darius read it 5 times, his hands shaking. Maya, his little girl who'd been 3 years old when he was playing at the Blue Note 10 when the accident happened, barely 12, when Sarah took her to Atlanta. He wrote back immediately, Maya. "Yes. God, yes. Please come." 3 weeks later, she was standing in his apartment doorway. She was beautiful, Sarah's features, but with his eyes tall and poised, wearing graduate school casual. And she was looking at him with an expression that mixed hopefulness with caution, with something that might have been pity. Darius had cleaned his apartment obsessively before she arrived, but there was only so much he could do with a space that was essentially a workshop. The piano dominated the room. Equipment was stacked on every surface. Notebooks and papers covered the walls. It looked like the lair of someone obsessed, which was accurate. They sat on the 2 chairs he owned. He'd borrowed the second one from Marcus upstairs, and looked at each other awkwardly for a long moment. Then Maya pulled out her phone and started typing. She'd come prepared with a text-to-speech app. She typed, the phone spoke, and Darius could read the words on the screen. "I've thought about you every day since Mom took me away. I was so angry at you for so long. I thought you'd just given up, that you didn't love us enough to fight through what happened. Darius felt tears starting and didn't try to stop them. He grabbed a notebook and wrote, "I did give up. For a long time I did. I'm sorry." Maya nodded, typed again. "Mom told me about the depression, about how bad it got. I understand more now that I'm older, but I still needed to see you to know what happened after we left." And so Darius told her. Not in real time, they couldn't communicate that quickly with typing and text-to-speech, but over the next several hours he showed her his notebooks, his equipment, his compositions. He played for her, showed her how he used the vibration platform and the transducers. He explained vibrational music theory as best he could in written notes. Maya watched it all with growing amazement. She'd come expecting to find her father still depressed, maybe still drowning, stuck in his loss. What she found instead was someone who'd transformed that loss into something new, who'd spent a decade building a framework for music that shouldn't be possible. "Dad," she typed, and the phone spoke in its neutral digital voice. "This is incredible. Have you shown this to anyone?" he wrote. "Tried. No one interested, no credentials, no institutional support. Just a deaf security guard with strange ideas." Maya looked troubled. She typed for a long time before showing him. "I need to tell you something. I'm at Berkeley. I'm a grad student in music technology. We study how technology can expand musical access and create new ways of experiencing sound. What you've built here, this is exactly what my entire department is interested in. And you've done it better than anything I've seen." Darius stared at the words, not quite believing them. Maya continued. "There's a professor in my department, Rebecca Hartwell. She's tough and skeptical and very academic, but she's also fair. If I could get you a chance to demonstrate this to her, to the department, Dad, this could matter. This could change things." They talked typed rather late into the night. Maya wanted to know everything about his research. Darius wanted to know everything about her life. She told him about studying piano as a teenager, about deciding she wanted to work in music technology, about her graduate program at Berkeley. "I think I went into this field because of you," she typed. "Because I saw what you lost and wanted to find ways to help people keep music in their lives, even when traditional methods failed." Before she left the next morning, Maya made him promise he'd let her help. She had a plan forming. It would take time, would require convincing her professor, would mean Darius would have to travel to California and present his work to a room full of skeptical academics. It might fail completely, but it's a chance, she typed. Maybe your only chance. Will you take it? Darius looked at his daughter. This woman he barely knew but loved desperately, and nodded. Yes, he'd take it. It took Maya 6 months to convince Professor Rebecca Hartwell that Darius should present at Berkeley. 6 months of persistent advocacy, of explaining his work, of showing Hartwell some of the recordings and documentation Maya had gathered during her visit to New Orleans. Hartwell was skeptical from the start. In her 30 years in musicology, she'd seen plenty of people making extraordinary claims about new ways to understand or create music. Most of them were either misunderstanding basic acoustic principles or selling something. The few who had legitimate ideas usually lacked the technical rigor to demonstrate them properly. A deaf man with no academic affiliation claiming he'd developed a new music theory based on vibration, it sounded frankly like the delusions of someone who couldn't accept what he'd lost. But Maya was persistent and credible. She was Hartwell's best research assistant, technically brilliant and methodical in her work. If Maya believed there was something here, Hartwell owed it to her to at least look. So she reviewed the materials Maya provided. And despite herself, despite her skepticism, she found aspects of it intriguing. The theoretical framework was more sophisticated than she'd expected. The documentation showed real experimental rigor. And the recordings of his performances, you couldn't tell from listening that the pianist was deaf. The playing was sensitive, expressive, technically proficient, which proved nothing really. Maybe he had some residual hearing. Maybe he'd developed the compositions before losing his hearing. Maybe he was playing from muscle memory. But it was interesting enough that Hartwell agreed to a demonstration. 1 hour, she told Maya. I'll arrange a seminar slot in the fall semester. He can present his work and take questions. But Maya, I'm doing this for you, not because I think this is going to be groundbreaking. Set expectations accordingly. When Maya called Darius with the news, he felt simultaneously elated and terrified. This was what he'd wanted, what he'd worked toward for 15 years, a chance to show the academic music community that his work was real, that he'd discovered something legitimate about music and human perception. But it was also the thing he'd been afraid of: exposure, judgment, the very real possibility that he'd present his life's work and the experts would dismiss it, would tell him he was deluded, would confirm every doubt he'd ever had about whether any of this was real or just an elaborate coping mechanism for a loss he couldn't accept. He had 3 months to prepare. He used every minute. He refined his presentation, practiced demonstrating his equipment, selected the compositions he'd perform, prepared answers to every question he could imagine someone asking. Maya flew to New Orleans twice to help him rehearse. On her second visit, they recorded a practice run of his presentation. When she showed him the video later, Darius could see what others would see: an older black man, weathered and somewhat shabby, explaining ideas that sounded impossible. He didn't look like a visiting scholar. He looked like someone you might pass on the street and not notice. That's good, Maya typed when she saw his discouraged expression. That's actually good. You'll walk into that room and they'll underestimate you. Then, you'll blow their minds. On November 15, 2010, Darius Bennett boarded a plane to California. It was his first flight in 18 years. He carried 2 suitcases, one with clothes, one with critical equipment he couldn't trust to checked baggage. His vibration platform had been shipped ahead. Maya met him at the airport. She'd arranged for him to stay at her apartment. That night, they set up his equipment in the Music Technology building where the demonstration would take place. The piano was already there, a beautiful 9-foot Steinway Grand, far better than anything Darius had played in decades. He stood looking at it for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly. Tomorrow, Maya signed to him she'd learned ASL fluently over the past 6 months. Tomorrow, you show them what's possible. That night, Darius barely slept. He ran through the presentation in his mind, imagined every way it could go wrong, tried to prepare himself for failure. But somewhere around 3 a.m., lying in Maya's guest room and staring at the ceiling, he found a kind of calm. This was it. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd survived, everything he'd discovered in 15 years of solitary research, tomorrow, it would either be validated or dismissed. Either way, he'd know. And maybe that was enough. When his alarm went off at 6, he got up, showered, put on the one suit he owned, 20 years old, but still presentable, and tried to quiet the voice in his head that said this was a mistake that he should cancel, that exposing himself to judgment would only lead to humiliation. At 9:45 a.m., Maya drove him to campus. At 9:55, they walked into the building. At 10:00, they entered the lecture hall. And there he was, 66 years old, 41 years after his first professional gig, 18 years after losing his hearing, standing at the front of a room full of skeptical academics who thought they knew everything about music. This was his chance, his one chance. And everything depended on what happened next. The lecture hall held about 300 people, and it was nearly full. Graduate students occupied the back rows. Faculty sat in the middle. The front rows held several professors emeritus, distinguished scholars who'd come out of retirement to witness what would either be a breakthrough or a spectacular failure. Professor Rebecca Hartwell sat in the front row center aisle, exactly where she always sat. She'd introduced Darius briefly. A guest speaker presenting unconventional research on musical perception, and now she watched him with the expression of someone prepared to be disappointed, but hoping to be surprised. Darius stood next to the piano next to Maya, who would interpret. His vibration platform was set up a 3-foot square wooden structure with transducers mounted underneath connected to an amplifier. It looked like something from a DIY electronics project, which it was. For a moment, he just looked at the audience. 300 people. 300 experts and students who would judge whether his 15 years of work meant anything. Maya signed to him. "Ready," he signed back. "Ready." She spoke for him using the prepared text they'd refined together. "My name is Darius Bennett. 18 years ago, I lost my hearing completely in a car accident. I was a professional jazz pianist. That accident ended my career and nearly ended my life. What I'm here to share today is how I learned to experience and create music without hearing it. Not music as a memory, not music as an intellectual exercise, but music as a real-time compositional practice using vibration as a primary sensory modality." Darius could see the skepticism in the room. He saw one professor in the third row actually roll his eyes. He saw students leaning over to whisper to each other. He saw Professor Hartwell with her arms crossed, her expression politely neutral, in a way that was somehow worse than obvious dismissal. Maya continued, "I know this sounds impossible. Music is sound and I can't hear sound. But sound is also vibration, and I can feel vibration. Over the past 15 years, I've developed what I call vibrational music theory, a framework for understanding and creating music through tactile perception rather than auditory perception." She walked to a whiteboard that had been set up and pulled up the first diagram, a frequency chart, showing how different piano notes corresponded to different vibration frequencies. Traditional music theory is grounded in psychoacoustics, how the human ear and brain process sound. Vibrational music theory is grounded in somatosensory perception, how the human body detects and interprets mechanical vibration. These aren't completely different domains. They're describing the same physical phenomenon, pressure waves propagating through a medium, but emphasizing different detection mechanisms. Maya's voice was clear and professional, delivering Darius's words, but Darius could see the audience wasn't convinced. This was theory. Anyone could come up with theory. What mattered was whether it actually worked. Professor Hartwell raised her hand. Maya nodded to her. "Mr. Bennett," Hartwell said, speaking slowly and clearly so he could read her lips. "What you're describing is certainly interesting from a theoretical perspective. We know that deaf individuals can perceive vibration. That's not in dispute. But music isn't just about detecting that vibration exists. It's about perceiving complex relationships. Harmony, melody, rhythm, timbre, dynamics. Can you actually perceive those elements through touch alone? Not remember them, not imagine them, but actually perceive them in real time." It was a fair question. It was the question. Everything came down to this. Darius nodded. Through Maya, he said, "Yes, and I can demonstrate." He sat at the piano, adjusting the bench. Then he stepped onto his vibration platform, making sure his feet were positioned correctly. The platform was connected to the piano through a digital interface. When he played, the sounds would be transmitted through the transducers in the platform, creating vibrations he could feel through his feet. Combined with the natural vibrations from the piano soundboard itself, which he'd feel through the bench and through the air against his body, he'd have enough tactile information to compose. I'm going to play an original composition, Maya interpreted. It's called Silent Symphony, and I composed it last year specifically for tactile perception. I'll play it twice. The first time, just listen and feel free to be skeptical. The second time, I'll explain what I'm doing, what I'm feeling, so you can understand how this actually works. He placed his hands on the keys, took a breath, and began to play. The piece started quietly, gently. Simple melody in the right hand, minimal accompaniment in the left. To the audience, it probably sounded pleasant enough, competent playing, nothing extraordinary. But they weren't listening for extraordinary. They were listening for errors, for signs that he couldn't really hear what he was doing, that this was memorized or faked. Darius played for about 3 minutes. The piece had structure, an A section, a B section, a return to A with variations. Nothing too complex, but showing clear compositional intent. When he finished, there was polite applause, the kind you give to any adequate performance. Professor Hartwell looked unmoved. A student in the back raised his hand. "That was fine," the student said. "But how do we know you didn't compose this before you lost your hearing, or memorize a piece someone else wrote? How do we know you're actually composing based on vibration?" Another fair question. And one Darius had expected. Through Maya, he said, "Ask me to improvise. Give me a chord progression, a style, whatever you want. I'll create music in real time, and you can judge whether I'm actually responding to what I'm doing or just playing something pre-planned." The student looked surprised. Professor Hartwell sat forward, slightly interested now. "All right," another professor said, from the middle rows, Dr. Wilson from the composition department, known for his harsh critiques. 12-bar blues in E-flat, standard progression. Let's see your tactile improvisation." Darius nodded. Blues in E-flat. He'd played 1,000 blues progressions in his former life, but this wasn't memory. This was real-time composition using only the vibration feedback from the platform and the piano. He started with a walking bass line in his left hand, establishing the rhythm and the root notes of the progression. His feet on the platform told him when he hit the right notes. Flat felt centered and strong. B-flat had a brighter, more energetic quality. A-flat was darker and more grounded. Then he started improvising in the right hand. Simple at first, testing his perception. Single-note runs following the chord changes. He could feel when the notes fit the harmony they created, stable vibration patterns, consonant relationships. When he played outside notes, the vibrations felt unstable, dissonant, which he could use for tension before resolving back to the chord tones. He started to relax, to let the muscle memory from his old life integrate with the new tactile perception he'd developed. The music became more fluid, more expressive. He threw in some bluesy bends, not pitch bends, which were impossible on piano, but rhythmic displacements and dynamic variations that gave the same feeling. The audience was quiet, now focused. This didn't sound memorized. It sounded spontaneous, alive, responsive, and more importantly, it sounded musical. It had phrasing dynamics, emotional content. It wasn't just hitting the right notes, it was making music. When Darius finished bringing the improvisation to a natural conclusion with a descending run and a solid E-flat chord, there was more substantial applause. Not enthusiastic, but genuine. But Professor Hartwell wasn't applauding. She was frowning, thinking. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "that was impressive. I'll admit I didn't expect that level of spontaneity, but I'm still not convinced this isn't just very sophisticated muscle memory combined with theoretical knowledge. You knew blues progressions before you lost your hearing. Your body remembers where the notes are. You're not really hearing or feeling the music. You're reconstructing it from memory. This was the moment Darius had known would come. The moment when technical competence wasn't enough, when the question became whether he was truly experiencing music or just simulating it. Through Maya, he said, "That's a reasonable skepticism. Let me try to explain what I actually experience when I play." He sat back down at the piano, positioned his hands over the keys. "When I press middle C," he said, through Maya's interpretation, actually pressing the key, "I feel a vibration with a frequency of about 262 hertz. I don't feel it as 262 discrete pulses per second. That's too fast for tactile perception. What I feel is the pressure wave that frequency creates. It feels steady, centered, medium weight. My fingertips detect higher harmonics. My chest feels the fundamental frequency. My feet on the platform feel the resonance through the structure." He played C and G together. "When I add a perfect fifth, the vibrations align. The waves reinforce each other. It feels stable consonant, almost locked together. My body experiences this as a unified sensation, not two separate notes, but a chord that has its own distinctive feel." He played C and F sharp together. A tritone feels different. The vibrations interfere with each other. There's a beating effect, a wobble, almost uncomfortable. This is acoustic physics. These intervals have these relationships, whether you hear them or feel them. I've just learned to read the tactile version of information that hearing people read through sound. He continued demonstrating, playing various intervals and chords, explaining through Maya what each one felt like. Major chords, bright, open, stable vibrations. Minor chords, darker, more complex patterns. Diminished chords, unstable, tense, begging for resolution. Some members of the audience were leaning forward now, genuinely interested. But others still looked unconvinced, and Professor Hartwell's expression remained neutral. Finally, she stood up. "Mr. Bennett, I appreciate the demonstration. This is clearly more sophisticated than I expected. But, and I say this with respect, you're still describing a very limited form of musical perception. You can detect consonance and dissonance through vibration." "Fine, that's interesting. But music isn't just chords. It's melody, it's rhythm patterns, it's timbre, it's the interaction of multiple voices, it's expression and interpretation, and 1,000 subtle elements that I don't believe can be transmitted through vibration alone." She paused, then continued. "What you've shown us is that you can play piano despite being deaf, using touch as a crude substitute for hearing. That's admirable, but it's not revolutionary. And calling it a new music theory seems like a vast overstatement. It's adaptation to disability, not a genuine expansion of how music can be understood." The room went very quiet. It was a harsh assessment, but not unfair by academic standards. Hartwell was challenging him to prove that this was more than just an interesting accommodation, that it genuinely revealed something new about music. Darius sat at the piano for a long moment, his hands resting on the keys. This was it. The moment that would determine whether 15 years of work meant anything. Through Maya, he said quietly, "You're right, that what I've shown so far is limited. But that's because I've been demonstrating basic principles. Let me show you what this actually enables. Let me show you what music feels like." Darius stood up from the piano and turned to face the audience fully. Maya stood beside him, ready to interpret. "You've heard me play compositions designed to demonstrate technical competence," he said through her. "Now I want to play something different, something that will help you understand what I actually experience when I create music through vibration. But to do that, I need to ask for your participation." He gestured to the platform he'd been standing on. "This platform has 4 transducers that convert audio signals into mechanical vibration. When I play the piano, these vibrations travel through the platform. Anyone standing on it can feel what I feel. It's not as nuanced as my perception after 15 years of training, but it will give you a sense of the information I'm working with." Professor Hartwell looked skeptical, but intrigued despite herself. Several students were already looking interested, eager to try. "I'm going to play a new piece," Darius continued. "It's called Remembering Sound, and it's dedicated to my daughter Maya, who brought me here today. As I play, I'll have Maya describe what I'm feeling, what information I'm processing, how I'm making compositional decisions in real time. And I'm inviting anyone who wants to step onto the platform to experience the vibration firsthand." He sat back at the piano. Maya positioned herself where she could see both Darius and the audience ready to narrate. "One more thing," Darius said through her. "This piece is about my journey from hearing to silence to this new way of experiencing music. It's emotional for me. But it's real. This is how I create now. This is who I am now." He placed his hands on the keys and paused, centering himself. Then he began. The piece started with a single note, repeated slowly, meditatively. Middle C struck softly. Maya spoke. He's feeling the fundamental vibration. Steady pulse, like a heartbeat. This is his baseline, his center. More notes joined, building a simple harmonic structure. C, E-G, a major triad, simple and pure. "The vibrations are aligning now," Maya narrated. Consonant patterns. He's feeling how they lock together, how they create a stable foundation. This represents his early life with music when everything felt natural and easy. The harmony shifted. New chords, more complex voicings. The mood darkened. Minor chords now. The vibration pattern is more complex, unsettled. He's moving into the difficult period when music became painful instead of joyful. Darius's playing grew more intense. His right hand played fractured melodies while his left hand provided restless, shifting harmonies. The music had genuine emotion, now anxiety loss, searching. Maya continued. He's feeling dissonance now, not just hearing it theoretically, but experiencing it physically. The vibrations are fighting each other, creating tension in his body. This is the accident, the loss, the silence. Some students in the front row were standing now, moving toward the platform. The first one, a young woman with short, dark hair, stepped onto it hesitantly. Her eyes widened. "Oh," she said softly. "Oh, I can feel it. It's like the music is coming up through my feet, through my whole body." Another student joined her, then another. Soon there were 5 people on the platform, all with expressions of wonder and concentration. Darius's playing changed again. The dissonant section resolved into something new. Not the simple consonants of the opening, but something more complex. Modal harmonies, jazz voicings, rhythmic patterns that seemed to pulse and breathe. This is his discovery, Maya narrated. When he learned he could feel music differently. The vibrations are complex now, but beautiful. Different kinds of beauty than before, but real beauty. He's using frequencies that create interesting tactile patterns. Low bass notes that pulse in your chest. Mid-range notes that dance in your fingertips. High notes that tickle your scalp when they resonate right. The students on the platform were swaying slightly unconsciously, moving with the music. One of them had closed her eyes, completely absorbed in the experience. Professor Hartwell was watching intently. Darius couldn't see her expression from where he sat, but Maya could, and she saw something shifting in the professor's face. The music built toward a climax. Darius's hands moved across the keys with increasing confidence and passion. This was a section about triumph, about finding a new identity, about refusing to let loss define him. "He's playing fortissimo now," Maya narrated. "The vibrations are powerful, almost overwhelming. Can you feel it? This is him claiming his place as a musician again. Not the musician he was, but the musician he became." More people were approaching the platform now. A professor from the third row, looking almost embarrassed, but too curious to resist. 2 more graduate students. Even Dr. Wilson, the harsh critic, was moving toward it. The platform was crowded now, people pressed together, all feeling the same vibrations traveling through the wooden structure, all experiencing a shadow of what Darius experienced every time he played. And something remarkable was happening. People were beginning to understand. You could see it in their faces. This wasn't just hitting the right notes. This wasn't muscle memory or theoretical knowledge. This was real musical perception just through a different sensory channel. The music shifted again, becoming more lyrical, more reflective. Darius was playing a melody now, simple and heart-achingly beautiful, accompanied by rich chords that seemed to shimmer with overtones. "This is his message," Maya said, and her voice was thick with emotion now. "He's saying that music isn't just sound. Music is organized vibration that creates meaning. Whether you perceive that vibration through your ears or through your body doesn't change the fundamental nature of what music is. It's pattern, it's relationship, it's emotion, translated into physical form." Professor Hartwell stood up. For a moment, Darius thought she was leaving, that she'd had enough, that the demonstration had failed. But she didn't leave. She walked toward the platform. The students made room for her. She stepped onto the wooden surface, positioning her feet carefully. Then she closed her eyes and just stood there, feeling. Darius played the climactic section now. Everything he'd learned, everything he'd discovered, everything he'd suffered and overcome, poured into the music. His hands flew across the keys, not showing off, but expressing. Complex jazz harmonies gave way to classical voicings, gave way to something that wasn't quite either, something new that existed in the space he'd discovered between hearing and feeling. On the platform, Professor Hartwell's face transformed. Her eyes opened, and there were tears in them. The music hung there at its peak for a long moment, a vast, complex chord that contained multitudes that vibrated through the platform and through the floor and through the very air of the room. Then Darius brought it down gradually, carefully. The intensity decreased. The complexity simplified. The piece wound its way back to where it had started, to that single middle C repeated slowly, like a heartbeat. Finally, silence. Real silence. Darius lifted his hands from the keys and sat there drained. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The people on the platform stood frozen still, feeling the last vibrations fade through the wood. Then Professor Rebecca Hartwell stepped off the platform. She walked to the piano, and she did something that shocked everyone in the room. She reached out and put her hand on Darius's shoulder. "Mr. Bennett," she said, speaking clearly so he could read her lips, tears still streaming down her face. "I owe you an apology, and I owe you my respect." She turned to face the audience, her voice shaking slightly but firm. "I have been studying music for my entire adult life. I have a PhD in musicology. I have published 17 books. I have taught hundreds of students. And in all that time, I have been operating under an assumption that I didn't even know I was making." She paused, collecting herself. "I assumed that music was fundamentally about sound. that hearing was not just the primary way to experience music, but the only real way, that anything else was a substitute, a workaround, something less than the authentic experience. She looked at Darius, then back at the audience. I was wrong. What I just felt on that platform. That is music. Not a translation of music, not a shadow of music, but actual musical information transmitted through a different modality. The relationships between notes, the emotional content, the structural logic, all of it was there. All of it was real. She turned back to Darius. You haven't just adapted to your disability. You've discovered something genuinely new about how music can be experienced and created. This is revolutionary, and I'm sorry it took me this long to see it. The room erupted. Not polite applause now, but genuine thunderous applause. People were standing, some of them crying, many of them looking stunned. Maya was sobbing openly, watching her father receive the recognition he'd deserved for 15 years. Darius sat at the piano, overwhelmed, barely able to process what was happening. Students were crowding around, wanting to talk to him, to ask questions, to understand more. Faculty members were discussing animatedly, already thinking about the implications for their own research. Dr. Wilson, the harsh critic, was shaking his head in wonder, saying to a colleague, "I've never seen anything like this. Never." But Darius was looking at Professor Hartwell. She was still standing next to the piano, and she was smiling at him, not a polite academic smile, but something genuine and warm. She pulled out a notebook and wrote quickly, then showed him. "Can you teach this? Can it be systematized, turned into a method that other deaf musicians could learn?" Darius took the notebook and wrote back. "That's what I've been trying to do for 15 years. That's why I documented everything. So it could be shared." Hartwell wrote again. "Then let's make that happen. Stay at Berkeley. Work with us. Let's turn this into a program, a legitimate field of study. Let's change how the world thinks about music and disability." Darius read the words 3 times, not quite believing them. Then he looked at Maya, who was nodding enthusiastically, signing yes, yes, yes. He looked back at Hartwell and wrote one word, yes. The demonstration was supposed to last 1 hour. It lasted 3. People stayed wanting to try the platform, wanting to hear more pieces, wanting to understand how Darius's method worked. And through it all, Darius played and explained and demonstrated, exhausted but energized, finally able to share what he'd discovered in all those years of solitary work. By the time it ended, the sun was setting outside. The lecture hall slowly emptied, people leaving in groups, still talking animatedly about what they'd experienced. Maya drove Darius back to her apartment. Neither of them spoke, communicated much during the drive. They didn't need to. Everything they needed to say was in the exhausted, happy silence between them. That night, lying in Maya's guest room, Darius thought about the journey that had brought him here, the accident that had destroyed his old life, the years of depression and despair, the moment of discovery with the radio, the decade of lonely research, the reunion with Maya, and finally this day when everything had somehow come together. He'd lost his hearing. That was true, and it would always be true. And some part of him would always mourn what that meant. But he'd found something else. Not a replacement for hearing, but something genuinely new, a way of experiencing music that was different, but no less real, a way of being a musician that nobody had quite conceived of before. And maybe, just maybe, he'd found a way to help others discover the same thing. For the first time in 18 years, Darius Bennett fell asleep feeling something he hadn't felt since before the accident. Genuine, uncomplicated hope about the future. The first week after the demonstration was a blur of meetings, interviews, and negotiations. Word spread quickly through Berkeley's music department, then through the broader university community, then, thanks to a blog post by one of the graduate students who'd attended onto social media. Within 3 days, there were articles in music education journals. Within a week, a reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle wanted to do a feature story. Within 2 weeks, Berkeley's administration was discussing the possibility of creating a new program focused on accessible music technology with Darius as its centerpiece. Professor Hartwell became Darius's most vocal advocate. She'd spent 30 years building her reputation as a rigorous, skeptical scholar who didn't accept claims without evidence. That reputation meant something. When she told colleagues that Darius's work was legitimate and important, they listened. She wrote an op-ed for the Journal of Music Theory, the same journal that had rejected Darius's paper years earlier, arguing that the field needed to broaden its understanding of musical perception beyond auditory modalities. The piece was titled "Sound Beyond Hearing," reconsidering the fundamental nature of musical experience. For too long, she wrote, "We have conflated music with sound, as if the physical phenomenon of organized pressure waves was meaningless without auditory perception." But music is not sound. Music is information structure, relationship pattern. Sound is merely one modality through which that information can be transmitted and received. Mr. Bennett's work demonstrates that vibrational perception can serve as an equally valid modality, one that opens up new possibilities for musical creation and understanding. The op-ed was picked up by mainstream publications. Suddenly, Darius Bennett wasn't just an obscure deaf musician with an interesting technique. He was a story the deaf composer who revolutionized music theory. The man who refused to let silence end his music. From tragedy to triumph, through vibration. Darius was uncomfortable with the media attention. He didn't particularly want to be inspirational. He just wanted to make music and share what he'd learned. But Maya helped him understand that the attention served a purpose. It legitimized his work, created opportunities, opened doors that would have stayed closed otherwise. Berkeley offered him a position as artist in residence, funded by a combination of departmental resources and a grant from a disability rights foundation that had heard about his work. The salary wasn't huge, but it was more money than Darius had seen in 2 decades. More importantly, it came with institutional support, lab space equipment funding, graduate assistance, and most crucially, legitimacy. He could finally stop being a lonely eccentric working in his apartment and become a researcher with a platform. The first course he taught was announced for the spring semester Tactile Music Composition Theory and Practice. The description emphasized that the course was open to both deaf and hearing students, that the goal was to explore vibrational perception as a complement to auditory perception, not a replacement for it. When registration opened, the course filled in 45 minutes. The wait list had 60 names on it. But the most meaningful impact wasn't institutional. It was individual. A deaf high school student in Los Angeles read about Darius's work online. Her name was Jennifer. She was 17. And she'd been discouraged by her school's music teacher from participating in music classes because of her deafness. When she read about what Darius had accomplished, she emailed him through Berkeley's website. The email was simple. "I thought I could never be a musician. Can you teach me?" A veteran who'd lost his hearing in Iraq saw the Chronicle article. He'd been a drummer before his injury, and he'd given up music completely believing it was impossible to continue. He drove to Berkeley from Sacramento just to meet Darius, to see if what the article described was real. A mother in Berkeley reached out about her 7-year-old daughter who'd been born deaf. She loves to dance, the mother wrote. She feels rhythms, but everyone tells her she can't study music. Can you help her? Within a month, Darius was working with a dozen students outside his official course, some deaf, some hearing, all interested in exploring music through vibration. He set up his equipment in one of Berkeley's practice rooms, and students would come for sessions learning to feel the difference between intervals to detect chord progressions, to understand rhythm through tactile sensation. Some of them struggled. Some of them. Vibrational perception was hard to learn, required patience and focus, and a willingness to trust a sense most people had never deliberately trained. But some of them got it quickly, naturally, as if they'd been waiting their whole lives for someone to tell them this was possible. Jennifer, the high school student from Los Angeles, was one of the naturals. Her mother drove her to Berkeley every other weekend for lessons with Darius. Within 3 months, she was composing her own pieces, simple but sincere, designed to maximize vibrational interest. She played them on the practice room piano, standing on Darius's platform, her face lit up with joy. "This is real," she told her mother through sign language after one session. "I'm actually making music. Not pretend music. Real music." Professor Hartwell documented everything. She saw the potential for peer-reviewed research for publications that would establish vibrational music theory as a legitimate field of study. She worked with Darius to write formal papers describing his methodology, his theoretical framework, his pedagogical approach. The first paper they co-authored was titled Somatosensory Musical Perception, a framework for composition and performance without auditory input. It was submitted to the Journal of Music Theory in January 2011. This time, it wasn't rejected. It was accepted with enthusiasm. The reviewers called it groundbreaking and paradigm-shifting. One reviewer wrote, "This paper challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of musical perception and opens up entirely new avenues for research and practice." When the paper was published in September 2011, it generated immediate discussion. Some musicologists were skeptical, arguing that vibrational perception couldn't really convey the full richness of musical experience, but many others were intrigued, excited by the possibilities this opened up. More importantly, it reached deaf musicians and educators around the world. A music school for deaf students in Washington, D.C. contacted Berkeley about implementing Darius's methods. A researcher in Sweden, who'd been working on haptic interfaces for music, reached out to collaborate. A composer in Japan, who was gradually losing his hearing, wanted to learn the technique as preparation for his own future. By the end of 2011, Darius had gone from complete obscurity to being a recognized figure in accessible music education. He'd been invited to present at 3 major conferences. 2 more papers were under review. And Berkeley was finalizing plans for a new research center focused on multimodal music perception with Darius as its founding director. His relationship with Maya had deepened into something beautiful. She'd become his primary collaborator, helping to document his methods, working with him to develop better equipment, serving as a bridge between his intuitive approach and the rigorous standards of academic research. They had dinner together twice a week. She visited his apartment. He'd moved to a larger place near campus to practice signing with him and plan future projects. One evening over takeout Thai food, Maya signed to him, "I'm proud of you, Dad. Not just for what you've accomplished, but for never giving up. Even when you were at your lowest, something in you kept fighting." Darius signed back, "I almost didn't fight. If that radio hadn't been playing that day, I was seconds away from ending it all. But you didn't." Maya signed. "That's what matters. And now look what you've created. You've changed lives. Jennifer, that veteran, my classmates who took your course, they all see music differently now because of you." Darius thought about that. It was strange to think that his personal tragedy, His years of suffering and isolation had somehow led to something that helped others. It didn't make the suffering worth it exactly. He'd still rather have his hearing back, would still rather have had those 18 years with his daughter. But it gave it meaning. It turned his loss into something that wasn't purely destructive. In December 2011, Professor Hartwell organized a showcase event, New Directions in Music Perception. It was part concert, part demonstration, part academic conference. The Berkeley Music Department's concert hall was packed with students, faculty, visiting scholars, and members of the community. Darius performed 3 of his compositions, including Remembering Sound. But he wasn't the only performer. Jennifer played a piece she'd composed called First Music, describing her experience of discovering vibrational music. 2 of Darius's students, one deaf, one hearing, performed a duet they'd created together, exploring how vibrational and auditory perception could complement each other. At the end of the evening, Professor Hartwell gave a brief talk about the future of this work, about the research possibilities, about the potential to transform how music education approached students with hearing impairments. What Darius Bennett has demonstrated, she said, is that disability is often just a mismatch between human capability and environmental support. We assumed deaf people couldn't be musicians because we only provided auditory pathways to music. But when we create vibrational pathways, when we meet people where they are, rather than demanding they meet us where we are, we discover capabilities we didn't know existed. She paused, looking at Darius in the front row. Mr. Bennett didn't just adapt to his disability. He revealed that our entire field had been making unnecessary assumptions about what music requires. And in doing so, he's expanded the boundaries of music itself. The applause was long and genuine. And sitting in that concert hall, surrounded by students and colleagues with Maya beside him, and his work finally recognized and valued, Darius felt something he hadn't felt in nearly 2 decades. He felt like a musician again. Not the same kind of musician he'd been at 28 playing jazz at the Blue Note, but a musician nonetheless. Someone who created music, who understood music, who contributed to the endless human conversation about what music could be and do. His journey wasn't over. There was still so much work to do, so many students to teach, so many compositions to create. But for the first time since the accident, he knew where he was going. He had a purpose, a community, a future. The silence would always be there, but it no longer defined him. 2 years later, spring 2015, the Center for Multimodal Music Perception occupied 3 rooms in Berkeley's music building with dedicated lab space practice rooms and a small concert venue. The walls were covered with vibration frequency charts, student compositions, and photographs of workshops and performances. Grant funding had allowed for state-of-the-art equipment, advanced transducer arrays, high-fidelity amplification systems, and custom-designed platforms that could create incredibly nuanced vibrational fields. Darius Bennett, now 69 years old, taught 2 courses per semester and mentored a dozen graduate students. His hair had gone completely white, and he'd gained a few pounds of contentedness, but his hands were as strong and precise as ever. He composed almost every day, creating pieces that pushed the boundaries of what vibrational music could express. The program had grown beyond his wildest expectations. 53 students, deaf and hearing, had taken his courses. 17 deaf musicians from around the country had come to Berkeley for intensive training in his methods. 2 doctoral dissertations were in progress, studying different aspects of vibrational music theory. But the most significant development wasn't academic. It was the community that had formed. Deaf musicians who'd given up on music had found a way back. Hearing musicians who'd never considered vibrational perception had discovered a new dimension to their art. Parents of deaf children had found hope that their kids could participate fully in musical life. Researchers were developing new technologies to make vibrational music more accessible. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, Darius was working with a new student. Her name was Keisha. She was 14, and she'd been born profoundly deaf. Her parents had brought her from Atlanta, hoping Darius could teach her the basics of his method over spring break. Keisha sat at the piano on the vibration platform, her hands positioned over middle C. Darius sat next to her, demonstrating signing instructions, watching her face for signs of comprehension. "Press the key gently," he signed. "Don't listen for sound. You know you can't hear it. Feel for the vibration. It comes through your fingertips, through the bench, through the floor. Let your whole body be the receiver." Keisha pressed middle C. Her eyes widened. "I feel it," she signed excitedly. "It's like a pulse, steady and strong." "Yes," Darius signed. "That's your center. That's home. Now try the next note up." Keisha played D, frowned in concentration. "It's different," she signed. "Faster. Brighter." "Good," Darius signed. "You're perceiving frequency through vibration. D vibrates faster than C. Your nerves detect that difference. Now play them both together." Keisha played C and D simultaneously, made a face. "It feels wrong," she signed, "like they're fighting." Darius smiled. "That's dissonance. Your body knows it feels unstable, wants to resolve to something more consonant. Try C and E instead." Keisha played C and E. Her face lit up. "Oh, that's better. They fit together. That's a major third," Darius signed. "One of the most consonant intervals. You just felt why thousands of years of musicians have loved that sound. The vibrations align naturally. They worked for an hour, Keisha learning to distinguish between intervals, starting to build a vocabulary of how different note combinations felt. By the end of the session, she could identify a perfect fifth by vibration alone. "Can I really learn to play music?" she signed to Darius as her parents came to pick her up. "Like real music, not just exercises, you already are playing real music," Darius signed back. "Every note you feel, every interval you understand, that's music. And yes, if you practice, if you train your perception, you can compose and perform at whatever level you want to achieve. I know because I did it. And if I could, you can." After they left, Maya arrived for their weekly dinner. She'd completed her PhD 2 years earlier and was now an assistant professor in the music technology department. Her research focused on developing better haptic interfaces for musical expression. Over sushi, she showed Darius her latest project, a glove embedded with tiny transducers that could create localized vibrations at each fingertip, potentially allowing for even more nuanced vibrational perception than his platform-based system. Imagine, she signed excitedly, if someone could feel the exact vibration of each note they're playing independent of the others. No need for platforms or amplifiers, just direct, precise vibrational feedback. "Patent it." Darius signed back. "Develop it. Make it available." This is how the work grows, each person adding their piece, building on what came before. That evening, Darius gave a video interview for a documentary about accessible music. The filmmaker had been following him for 6 months, gathering material for a feature-length film about his life and work. Through an interpreter, Darius talked about his journey. The glory days in New Orleans, the devastating accident, the years of depression, the discovery, the long research period, the breakthrough at Berkeley. "What do you want people to understand about your work?" the filmmaker asked. Darius thought for a long moment before signing his response. "I want people to understand that music isn't just sound. Sound is one way to transmit musical information, but it's not the only way. Music is fundamentally about pattern relationship structure, emotion. Those things can exist in many modalities. When we insist that music requires hearing, we're artificially limiting what music can be and who can participate in musical life." He paused, then continued. "I lost my hearing. That was real, and it was devastating. But what I discovered was that I hadn't lost music, I'd just lost one way of accessing it. And finding the new way, the vibrational way, taught me things about music that I never understood when I could hear. It expanded my understanding. It made me a better musician, not despite my disability, but partially because of it." "Do you consider yourself an inspirational figure?" the filmmaker asked. Darius smiled slightly and signed, "I consider myself a musician who had to solve a hard problem. The problem was, how do I continue being a musician when I can't hear? I spent 15 years finding an answer. The fact that my answer helps other people is wonderful, but that's not why I did it. I did it because I needed to. Because music is who I am, and I couldn't let go of that even when everything seemed to say I should." After the interview, Darius walked across campus to his favorite spot, a bench overlooking the bay. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. He sat there for a while, watching students pass by, feeling the vibrations of their footsteps through the bench, the pulse of traffic from the distant freeway, the rhythm of the world around him. He thought about the boy he'd been learning piano from his grandmother, the young man who'd played jazz at the Blue Note, the devastated 35-year-old who'd lost everything, the desperate 38-year-old who'd decided not to pull the trigger, the isolated researcher working in obscurity for a decade, the father reunited with his daughter, the teacher working with students like Keisha. All those versions of himself connected by the thread of music. Not the same music, the form had changed, the modality had shifted, the understanding had deepened, but still always fundamentally music. Maya found him there an hour later. "What are you thinking about?" she signed. "I'm thinking," Darius signed back, "that I'm grateful. For all of it, even the hard parts, because they led here to this moment, to this life. I wouldn't have chosen the path, but I'm proud of where it brought me." Maya sat beside him. Father and daughter watching the sunset together, both of them feeling the vibrations of the world around them. Both of them knowing that silence and sound were just 2 points on a spectrum of human experience, both of them at peace. The story of Darius Bennett challenges us to reconsider what we think we know about human limitation and potential. When he lost his hearing at 35, it seemed like the end of his identity, his career, his purpose. By every conventional measure, his life as a musician was over. No amount of determination or positive thinking could restore what the accident had taken away. But Darius discovered something that transformed his understanding of both music and disability. The limitations we perceive are often just failures of imagination. We tell ourselves that certain things are impossible, that you can't make music without hearing it, that you can't compose without auditory feedback, that some disabilities simply close off certain life paths forever. And then someone like Darius proves us wrong. Not by denying his disability or pretending it doesn't matter, but by refusing to accept that his disability defined what was possible for him. He lost his hearing. That was real. But he didn't lose his connection to music, because music, he discovered, was bigger and more flexible than anyone had fully understood. His journey illustrates several profound truths about innovation and adaptation. First, genuine innovation often comes from necessity. Darius didn't develop vibrational music theory as an academic exercise. He developed it because he desperately needed a way to reconnect with the art form that defined him. The desperation drove creativity that might never have emerged from comfort. Second, breakthroughs require patience and isolation. Darius spent 15 years developing his methods before anyone besides him knew they existed. 15 years of solitary work, constant doubt, repeated failure, and gradual progress. In our age of instant gratification and viral success, we often forget that profound discoveries take time. They require dedication through periods when no one believes in you, when you barely believe in yourself, when there's no external validation or reward. Third, the greatest barriers are often conceptual, not physical. The deaf community had existed for centuries. The physics of vibration were well understood. The possibility of perceiving music through touch wasn't hidden. But no one had quite put it together the way Darius did, because no one had challenged the fundamental assumption that music required hearing. Once that assumption was questioned, once people allowed themselves to imagine music as something beyond sound, entire new possibilities opened up. Fourth transformation rarely happens alone. Darius's breakthrough required not just his own work, but Maya's advocacy, Professor Hartwell's willingness to reconsider her assumptions, and the broader community's openness to new ideas. Individual genius matters, but so does the social context that determines whether that genius is recognized or ignored. Since that demonstration at Berkeley in 2010, Darius's methods have spread globally. There are now programs using vibrational music theory in 12 countries. Over 200 deaf students have learned to compose and perform using his techniques. 3 textbooks have been published on the subject. The field of accessible music has been fundamentally transformed. But the impact goes beyond the deaf community. Hearing musicians have discovered that vibrational perception adds a dimension to their musical understanding they didn't know was missing. Neuroscientists studying multimodal perception have gained new insights from examining how Darius's brain adapted to process musical information through touch. Instrument makers are designing new devices that integrate vibrational feedback as a core feature rather than an afterthought. The technology has advanced significantly from Darius's crude homemade platform. Companies now manufacture sophisticated haptic systems designed specifically for musical application. Vibration-responsive clothing allows performers to feel music across their entire body. Even concert halls are experimenting with installing subfloor transducer arrays so deaf audience members can experience orchestral performances through full-body vibration. This technological development matters because it makes Darius's methods accessible to more people. But it's important to remember that the technology alone isn't what's revolutionary. Darius proved the concept with equipment cobbled together from junk electronics and recycled speakers. The revolution was conceptual, the realization that music exists independent of any particular sensory modality, that human beings are capable of developing new ways of perceiving and creating when given the opportunity and support to do so. Today, at 73, Darius Bennett continues teaching and composing. He's published over 60 original compositions designed for vibrational performance. He's mentored 37 graduate students. He's given keynote addresses at conferences around the world. He's been featured in documentaries, academic journals, and mainstream media. But when asked about his legacy, what he wants to be remembered for, he always gives the same answer. I want to be remembered as someone who refused to let other people's limitations become my limitations. who refused to accept that disability meant inability, who found a way forward when everyone said there was no path. Not because I'm special, but because that's what humans do. We adapt. We innovate. We find ways to be who we need to be, even when circumstances seem impossible. He usually adds, "And I want to be remembered as someone who expanded the definition of music." Music isn't sound. Music is organized information that creates meaning and emotion. Sound is just one modality for transmitting that information. When we understand that, really understand it, we open up possibilities we can't even imagine yet. There's a broader lesson here, one that extends far beyond music or disability. We live in a world that constantly tells us what's possible and what's not, what we can be and what we can't be. Those boundaries are often presented as natural, inevitable, fixed. But Darius's story reminds us that many of those boundaries are artificial. They exist because we haven't yet imagined the alternatives, because we're constrained by historical limitations that technology or creativity or sheer determination might overcome. The next time you encounter something that seems impossible, remember Darius Bennett. Remember that a deaf man became one of the most innovative music theorists of the 21st century by refusing to accept that deafness and musicianship were incompatible. Remember that what seems impossible might just be unexplored. Remember that human capability is almost always greater than our current methods allow us to express. Remember that disability often reveals the arbitrary nature of how we've designed our world, and that designing differently can unlock potential we didn't know existed. And remember that sometimes the most profound innovations come not from avoiding limitations, but from engaging with them directly, from asking not, "How can I get back to how things were?" but "What new possibilities emerge from how things are now?" Darius lost his hearing at 35 and spent years in despair, believing his life was over. But at 53, he stood in front of 300 skeptics and revolutionized their understanding of music. 18 years of suffering. 18 years of isolation and doubt and struggle. And then everything changed. Your own transformation might not take 18 years. It might happen faster or slower. It might look completely different. But the principle remains. It's never too late to discover who you can become when you refuse to accept other people's limitations as your own. It's never too late to find a new way forward. It's never too late to make something beautiful from your losses. Because sometimes, often, the most profound music isn't heard with the ears. It's felt with the soul. And no disability, no limitation, no setback can take that away from someone determined to keep creating, keep growing, keep pushing against the boundaries of what's considered possible. That's the legacy of Darius Bennett. Not just that he made music without hearing, but that he showed all of us what becomes possible when we're willing to reimagine the fundamental nature of what we thought was fixed and unchangeable. The question now is, what will you reimagine?